Thanks a lot. Again, I'm Courtney Duke. I'm the city's pedestrian coordinator at the Office of Transportation, but I also was a team member on the Transportation System Plan since about 1988. And I'm here with Jeanne Harrison. Do you want to say something?
I'm one of the senior transportation planners who's worked on the development of the Transportation System Plan since it began, and it actually was a fairly lengthy process, so I'm the only surviving member that started on the plan and also finished it.
And what we're going to present today is that we gave a bunch of briefings and sort of trainings to Office of Transportation staff as well as consultants and outside agencies. So we're giving that similar presentation but with a little bit of a twist for the students and highlighting a few things that we didn't highlight before. Feel free to ask questions during the presentation, and I think we'll start. The Transportation System Plan, we call it the TSP, and if we use too much jargon or too many acronyms, let us know also and raise your hand and ask us what we mean. It was adopted by City Council in October of 2002, and it went into effect on December 14th, 2002. It was adopted by a city ordinance by City Council, so it has the force of law. We really just want to try to help you understand the TSP goals, its policies, how we got to where we are today, and also a little bit of how to use the document when you want to use it. The TSP, it's a 20-year guide for the Office of Transportation and the city's transportation policies, projects, and activities. It replaces what used to be called the transportation element, and it gives a 20-year big picture look at transportation in Portland. So why do we need a TSP? And what are the underlying reasons that a comprehensive transportation plan is needed? First, as most of you know, as being MERP students, we need to manage growth and resources in our city. We're a growing population, not only with people, but with cars. We're going to be growing more over the next 20 years. People are going to be driving further and driving more often. So we need a comprehensive plan to ensure that transportation services are efficiently provided to accommodate growth, but we want to do that within our limits, our financial limits, our human limits, and our environmental resources. We need a holistic approach to address the imbalances in our system and create balance. Secondly, we need to manage congestion. If we're having more people here, our roadways are obviously becoming increasingly congested each year. And the transportation system capacity needs to be carefully managed to ensure efficient mobility of people and goods. And that's not just in an auto, but also including transit riders, bicyclists, and pedestrians. And finally, we need to protect our livability. As travel demand grows in the city, neighborhoods are increasingly impacted by traffic-related problems such as cut-through traffic on local streets, speeding, pollution, and there's also safety issues with that. So what is the Transportation System Plan? We've got some reasons as to why we wanted to do that. What is it? Well, first of all, it's a new long-range comprehensive transportation plan for the city of Portland. It's an integrated approach, which is new, to guide how and where we invest our transportation system over the next 20 years. And we think of the Transportation System Plan as sort of a big umbrella. It shelters a lot of different transportation-related components in the city. And one of those components is the 20-year plan. The TSP as a whole is a comprehensive guide to transportation planning for the city of Portland. The plan includes policies, needs assessments, identifies actions to meet those needs, through capital improvements, through programs, as well as regulatory code revisions. The TSP also includes a set of transportation policies. This is known as the transportation element of the comprehensive plan, and we're going to talk about these policies more later. The TSP includes new and updated citywide and district policies that are a part of the comp plan. And we've got 3 goals as a part of the comprehensive plan. We've got Goal 6, Goal 11B, and the City TMP, which is the Central City Transportation Management Plan. I knew that. And we're going to discuss all 3 of those goals in more detail later. So the TSP really creates a framework for the decision making and assuring coordination with other city policies as well. The Transportation System Plan is also the city's Transportation Public Facilities Plan. This element of the Transportation System Plan includes major transportation improvements, also known as the projects or the project list. State law requires that cities develop a public facilities plan for transportation, and this part of the TSP satisfies that state requirement. This part of the plan was last updated in 1988, so it was in need of revision. And then the TSP also meets our state and regional requirements. The State Transportation Planning Rule outlines specific elements and goals for transportation system plans. And the Regional Transportation Plan is Metro's TSP. The RTP contains policies and projects to accommodate projected growth in the region as a whole. So Portland's TSP must be in compliance with the RTP, and if it's not, we have to explain why and have some studies related to that. So briefly, I'm sure a lot of you know about the State Transportation Planning Rule and the state goals in Oregon since you are students, but we'll go ahead and go over it for those who aren't familiar. There's 19 state planning goals in Oregon. 13 of them apply to the city of Portland, and Goal 12 is the transportation goal. The Transportation Planning Rule, also known as the TPR, was adopted in 1991 and again updated in 1999. This was done through the State Land Conservation and Development Commission, which is an administrative body appointed by the governor. A number of jurisdictions were either not meeting Goal 12 or ignoring Goal 12. So the TPR was adopted to ensure that all jurisdictions in Oregon are addressing the state's transportation goals. So the TPR is a set of rules and benchmarks that each jurisdiction in the state, including all of those in Metro, must meet to ensure that Goal 12 is met. So there's a number of specific elements that we have to include, and one of those is support alternatives to driving alone for every trip. The TPR requires jurisdictions to provide facilities for bikes, pedestrians, carpooling, and transit. The TPR also sets specific goals for reducing vehicle miles traveled per capita. The larger jurisdictions like Portland region have more requirements placed on them because that's where there's congestion is more problematic. The TPR also requires that we reduce parking spaces per capita. The reduction of parking spaces can reinforce the idea of using other modes of travel rather than the single occupant vehicle. And then the region has done this through parking maximums. And then we also need to maintain our clean air and water. Travel patterns can affect air and water pollution, and some of this environmental emphasis was added in the 1999 update. So how did we create the plan? What was our public involvement process? Well, we had a lot of citizen involvement over the course of the plan. We had a Citizens Advisory Committee that started in 1996 and met over 60 times over that period, as well as attending all of our outreach events. We had, as a part of that, we had interactive workshops, focus groups, newsletters, staff presentations. In the fall of 1998, we had 8 workshops throughout the city in each transportation district to do a needs assessment, to ask the citizens, is there something we've missed in already the existing neighborhood plans, in the existing plan? What does your neighborhood need to have a better transportation system? All of that was incorporated into the plan and into the project list. We also coordinated with other agencies, Metro, TriMet, ODOT, the Port. We're all integral in the development of the plan and were members of our technical advisory committee. We also had advisory committee members from other city bureaus, including the Bureau of Environmental Services, which deals with sewers and stormwater, the Bureau of Development Services, which implements the code, parks, the Portland Development Commission, as well as the Bureau of Planning. We also incorporated previous and concurrent planning efforts. These include planning studies and projects that identified needs in specific areas, and we wanted to make sure to include all of that in the transportation system plan. Examples of this include what's called the Hollywood Sandy Plan, which is a land use and transportation plan, the St. John's Truck Strategy, which is a truck strategy for the St. John's industrial and freight area, as well as the Tacoma Main Street Plan. So all these plans, projects, and policies were incorporated into the TSP. While we were working on the TSP, some of our themes came about because, as we've talked about, Portland's a nearly built-out city. It's a city surrounded by other growing cities and counties. And since we believe that we can't build our way out of congestion, we need to really manage the existing system efficiently. So the TSP creates transportation choices so people are not limited to only one mode of travel. And that's why the TSP themes represent the principles carried throughout the TSP. So there's 5 things that are weaved throughout the TSP to keep in mind. So first, again, is transportation choices. There's an emphasis on providing a variety of convenient and accessible transportation options to accommodate all different types of transportation needs. This really incorporates the idea of the efficient use of our existing transportation system. We also have stewardship. We really need to protect Portland's investment in our existing transportation infrastructure. We do this by emphasizing efficient use of resources, fiscal responsibility, finding non-capital solutions to problems, and partnering with other agencies to make improvements, such as PDC and the port. We also support the Region's 2040 growth concept. This concept, again, as some of you may know, was developed by Metro and supports the development of high-density, mixed-use areas to maintain neighborhoods and a healthy economy and reduce urban sprawl. It focuses growth in regional centers, town centers, and main streets. And so the Transportation System Plan, in terms of its planning and its projects, supports growth in those areas. Environmental sustainability. This emerged as a theme during the development of the plan. The TSP emphasizes the use of best management practices to protect air and water quality and reduce energy consumption. Encouraging alternatives to the auto also supports environmental sustainability goals. And finally, and somewhat most importantly for a lot of us, is this a comprehensive and unifying approach. The TSP creates what we hope is a living document that will be used and updated over time. The TSP, for the first time, combines policy, implementation, and evaluation into one comprehensive document. So we really want, for us, we think it would be a real user-friendly document as well. So just some of the plan highlights, and these are the things that we're going to talk about in the rest of the presentation. We've got transportation policies and street classifications. We've got a 20-year list of major transportation improvement projects. We have a financial plan. How are we going to pay for all this? We have some refinement plans and studies that need to happen over the course of the plan. We have some modal and management plans. We have some implementing strategies, including code changes. We have performance measures and benchmarks to gauge how we're doing throughout the plan. So now Jeanne is going to talk about some of the transportation policies in the TSP. Are there any questions so far? Okay, thanks a lot.
Okay, I wanted to go in a little bit more in depth on what our policies are. I won't explain how they've changed so much as just let you know that there wasn't a radical rethinking of how we've done transportation in the City of Portland. It's more of a fine-tuning and putting more emphasis on certain elements that we already had in place. The city has 12 goals in its comprehensive plan, and as Courtney said, the TSP really addresses Goal 6 and Goal 11B of that plan, as well as the Central City Transportation Management Plan goal. We organize the policies under topic headings, both to make them more user-friendly and also to show sort of how things fit together. So our first group of policies are the coordination and public involvement policies, and this is where we have a policy on education. There was a lot of emphasis from the community in wanting us to stress education as a key tool in addressing transportation issues in the city. And sort of our lighthearted comment is always, everybody thinks the other person needs to be educated about transportation, not themselves. So we had the community saying that the truckers needed to have education, and the truckers saying that the community needed to understand more about freight movement. So we've tried to incorporate all of that under this group of policies. We have a set of policies that address transportation function. It explains how our streets should function. The TSP is a policy-based document, which means we don't look at our streets and say this is what it's carrying in terms of traffic today and then classify them accordingly. We really look at how we want each individual street to operate in the future if it's not operating that way today, and we classify it according to that system. We also talk in this area about traffic calming and other measures you can take for the street system to make sure that it is operating properly. We have a group of land use and transportation policies, again emphasizing how the link between the two and looking at how that helps to implement Region 2040 and ensuring that we have adequate transportation facilities to address growth over time. The pedestrian and bicycle policies are based primarily on the bike and pedestrian master plans that were adopted a few years ago by the city, and it provides that link between the master plans and the TSP. The public transportation policy addresses the many kinds of public transportation that we have in Portland, including light rail and the streetcar, and our bus system, We look at light rail as sort of the backbone of our system. The transit system becomes the rest of the skeleton. Streetcar is a very popular part of that skeleton. It also looks at things like the park and ride policy for transit facilities, whether we're going to do those or not, sets up criteria for that. And it also talks about more innovative or untried types of transportation, at least in Portland, things like paratransit, which would include water taxis, which we have evaluated in the past. We have parking and demand management policies. These are designed to reduce auto travel demand, and use land efficiently. We have some of the strictest parking regulations probably anywhere in the country. We're frequently called up and said, how do you do it in Portland? And when we explain what we do, the usual response is, well, we couldn't do it here, whatever the city happens to be. So we really do have some pretty strict parking policies that support the kinds of things that we have, parking controls that we have here in the city. We have freight terminals and truck policies. These were significantly strengthened in this development of the transportation system plan over what we'd had previously, and that really is a reflection of the limited capacity we have in our regional network. Trucks are an important part of our economy. We need to make sure that the freight goods can get in and out of the city, and so there is a lot of emphasis on freight movement. And we also have regional transportation policies that explain the city's approach to the regional facilities that are within the city of Portland, as well as addressing intermodal facilities such as the airport and Union Station. And it describes the city's philosophy about regional transportation policies such as congestion pricing and commuter rail. The street classifications and descriptions are an important part of the transportation system plan and of the comprehensive plan. Portland has classified its streets since 1977. Again, as I said, it's policy-based on how we want the streets to function. With the TSP, we now classify the streets for 7 different types of movement or design. So we have traffic classifications, transit classifications, and those were restructured quite a bit with the TSP. Bicycle and pedestrian classifications, and that includes pedestrian districts, and we added several pedestrian districts. Freight classifications used to be known as truck. Freight, because we went to the change to put more emphasis on the whole system of freight movement, just not the truck part of that. We have a classification for emergency response, which is a way of delineating where and where not certain kinds of traffic calming devices are appropriate so that emergency response vehicles are not slowed in their response times. And we have a street design policy which is new, and this is something that the Metro adopted a set of street design classifications as part of their regional transportation plan. We were required to have a similar set of classifications. We put a sort of Portland spin on that, and we also added in a new classification called greenscape streets that are reflective of the beautification policy that we had previously. All the streets are classified, as I said, on all 7 of these different classifications. And every street, even if it serves only a local purpose, still is classified all 7 ways as a local service street for that type of movement. Let's see, the district policies. We also have a set of district policies, one for each of the 7 districts outside the central city. The maps that go with those district policies describe these seven different classifications. The policies are specific to the streets in that part of the city. Sometimes we have a specific policy or an objective that addresses a specific intersection or a type of problem that's been identified by the community in that district. Goal 11B is our public rights-of-way policy, and this is how we show compliance with the public facilities plans requirements of the state. Goal 11B relates to public rights-of-way. Other parts of Goal 11 relate to other kind of services that are covered as public facilities, such as sewer and water, police, schools, open space, things like that. We have structured this policy to sort of complement Goal 6. I think of Goal 6 as explaining what we want the overall transportation system to look like in Portland for all different modes. And Goal 11B is really how do we get there? How do we build the system and make it what we want it to be? So we talk about environmental sustainability, how we build and maintain the system to be sympathetic and responsive to environmental issues. We have a project selection policy and criteria. These were developed in conjunction with our Citizen Advisory Committee. It talks about how we should rank projects. We used it not only to evaluate projects for inclusion in the TSP, but also over time how projects will be added to the TSP. And that relates to our capital improvement program. So the criteria identified in this policy are actually part of our capital improvement planning process. We have a quite lengthy set of street design and right-of-way improvements policy and objectives. This describes how you build the system for various modes without getting into things like standards, but at a policy level, what do we want the system to look like? We have a street plans policy. We're required to have master street plans for all portions of the city. As those are completed, we add them to the transportation system plan. We've done several large-scale projects for districts in Portland, but we also have some very site-specific kinds of street plans for smaller areas like the Gateway Regional Center, where we want to have a very tight grid of streets, and so we have a separate street plan just for that area. We have a maintenance policy that talks about the importance of maintaining our system over time. Especially in times of shrinking budgets, and it's important to do the right kind of maintenance at the right time so that the system does not deteriorate over time to where it's going to be even more expensive to repair and replace. And finally, we have a set of performance measures that address how the transportation system works at the regional level, that is consistent with the regional level of service table, and also how we want this. How do we evaluate the system over time on both the regional level or system-wide level, as well as individual land use cases are applied for, and we need to evaluate the impacts of those land use cases. As Courtney mentioned, we have also something called the Central City Transportation Management Plan. That was adopted in 1995, but it was always separate from the rest of the city's transportation policies. We've incorporated the 1995 CCTMP into the TSP. We did not change goals and policies. Those are going to be done under a new project that's just getting started now. But we did update the classification maps to be consistent with regional classifications, as well as to integrate better with the areas surrounding the central city. And then we also added classifications for emergency response and street design.
Okay, thanks, Jeanne. Are there any questions about the policies? All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about another umbrella. There's a lot of non-policy components of the transportation system plan, and Jeanne just went over the 3 policy components. One of these non-policy components is the transportation improvements and funding section, which we also call the project list. The project list was built on existing projects. There are very few totally new projects, since we did a lot of combining and looking at other existing projects. They came from the capital improvement project list. They came from neighborhood plans. They came from the district workshops that I mentioned before, as well as projects from the PDC, the port, the community, as well as the regional transportation plan. We started with a little over 2,000 projects and ideas at the end of all that gleaning together of ideas. This was reduced to approximately 395 projects that were adopted in the plan. This reduction was mainly due to combining projects, especially on a corridor, removing duplicate projects, as well as removing projects that were really maybe more programmatic items, or were policies, or had been completed, or were really dealt with in a different part of the Office of Transportation. So there's 2 sections to the sort of project list. The first is the major transportation system improvements. These projects are generally larger projects. They're generally more expensive, and really most important, they respond to our regional responsibilities and meet the mandated TRP goals that we talked about before. This list also allows us to have projects already identified as, when we hope, additional funding sources come around. Projects from the Transportation System Plan feed into our capital improvement program. Major projects should be on the Transportation System Plan if they're going to be added to the CIP. There will be a process to change the TSP list to update that, and that'll be approximately every 2 to 5 years to add those major projects. Projects, if you look at the document, you can see that they're banded into time frames of 1 to 5 years, 6 to 10 years, and 11 to 20 years. This is a sort of an estimate based on the need and priority in that area. With some pretty rough costs identified with those projects. Some of those costs were created in the mid to late 90s, and so probably should add some money to those if you look at that. Projects can be changed out within that 20-year time period. For example, if there's a project in the 6 to 10-year band, but we receive some earmarked funding from some source that says, here's the money, but it has to be built in the next 1 to 5 years, we could do that. We'd have to do some analysis and make sure we're still meeting all of our policies and benchmarks, but things can be moved around within that 20-year list. One thing to note is that the project list was adopted as a part of the comprehensive plan. So any changes to the project list does require an amendment to the comprehensive plan. And so that's one reason we're not going to be doing it every year. The second part of the project list is what we call our reference list projects. This is another source of potential transportation improvements. It's listed in our appendix. Reference list projects generally have little or no impact on reducing the vehicle miles traveled, or are not necessarily major system improvement projects. Projects can be costly, but again, they're not necessarily meeting those major goals. This list was also built from existing project lists, especially from our smaller pedestrian and bicycle master plan projects, from the traffic calming project list. This list is not adopted as a part of the comprehensive plan, so it's a much more fluid list, and projects can be added and subtracted, again, based on looking at policies and objectives and benchmarks, but again, does not require an amendment to the comprehensive plan. And it's not as well organized. If you're looking for a project in there, it's not quite as organized as the major project list, but will hopefully be at a later date. And then finally, how do we pay for all of that is a part of our TSP. So we do have a financial plan, and we have 3 funding scenarios. The funding scenarios are obviously allocations of scarce dollars. If we combined all the projects in the 20-year list and then a set percentage of a set amount of dollars for reference list projects, we get a total finance plan, I always have to read it, is $1.178 billion. And of course, that's our most optimistic scenario, and that includes obviously new funding sources. Half of that amount is for regional transportation projects that actually don't include ODOT projects. So as funding realities change, the financial plan as well as some of the projects will need to be adjusted either positively or negatively. We also have some refinement plans and studies that need to be completed for the aspects of the TSP. Refinement plans resolve regional or local transportation needs that could not necessarily be addressed during the TSP process. This could be due to lack of funding for the project, lack of time, a lot of times just not enough information to complete that. That City TMP update that Jeanne just mentioned is an example, as well as the completion of the master street plans. The TPR says that refinement plans must be completed in the next 3 years. We also have some studies. These address more localized transportation issues that were identified by the community that, again, that we didn't necessarily have enough time or information to incorporate into the TSP. Some examples of this include the truck and freight study that's going on right now. There's a division vision plan that's actually starting at the moment. Studies can be undertaken over the lifetime of the plan, and especially as funding and priorities identify them. So if the TSP is a big umbrella, the modal plans are sort of smaller umbrellas. We're going to go through these pretty quickly, but these really bring elements of all the different modes together. It's a really good summary about what is Office of Transportation, what is the City of Portland doing for each mode. So if you can only read one section of the TSP, this should give you some idea as to what's going on. Then it references you to other parts of the TSP to get the actual information. So we have modal plans for motor vehicle, pedestrians, bicycles, freight, air, rail, water, and pipeline. We have public transportation and transportation disadvantaged. Quick note on transportation disadvantaged. It's defined in Goal 12 as people who have difficulty in obtaining transportation due to age, health, physical, mental disability, or income. But it can also mean that there's a lack of facilities or poor quality facilities. We also have some management plans. Modal plans generally refer to how you move around the system in a particular mode. A management plan talks a little bit about managing other parts of the system and how we operate the system. So we have a transportation demand management and parking plan. This really has a lot of strategies to encourage people to shift some of their trips from the auto to other modes. And then we also have a transportation system management plan. This really describes ways to make the existing system safer and smarter, strategic improvements to enhance our operational efficiency. These are things like transit priority streets, signal detection loops for bicycles, coordinated signals, and this is also where a lot of our traffic calming strategies are located. So again, it's just a good place to get some background and information. As part of the transportation planning rule requirements, we have to measure our progress in implementing the plan and achieving our goals. So we've developed 13 performance measures, which will all have quantitative benchmarks to measure our progress. When we updated the plan, when we adopted the plan, we only had the state mandated benchmarks finalized. These benchmarks measure Portland's increase in non-single occupant vehicle mode split, and reduction of our VMT per capita. So we have background data and baseline information for all the other 13 performance measures. These things include linear feet of sidewalk, miles of bikeways, travel time in key corridors, freight delay is one of those two. And then sometimes we just didn't have enough information, enough baseline information to set those benchmarks and to determine what they'll be. So we're going to evaluate the performance measures and benchmarks as a part of our 5-year update of the TSP. In the meantime, we have started monitoring all the different performance measures to help us set those benchmarks in the future. So a part of that and the way that the projects were set up and the sort of bands of projects is that not every type of say capacity project or bicycle project is within the first 1 to 5 years, because we've got to meet a variety of different benchmarks and performance measures every 5 years. So we might have to modify our benchmarks, modify our performance measures or our project list and funding priorities to make sure that we're meeting all of those benchmarks and performance measures. Okay, so now Jeanne is going to talk about some implementation strategies that were a part of the transportation system plan.
One of the important things that the TSP had is not just a set of policies and projects, but actual strategies to implement portions of the transportation system plan immediately. We made amendments to 3 city codes, Title 16, which is vehicles and traffic, 17, which is public improvements, and 33, which is the zoning and planning code. I'm going to talk about those in a little bit more detail next, but first I wanted to talk about the other implementation strategies. We have street standards in the TSP. Those were developed as part of the recent update to the Land Division Code for the City of Portland. They're street standards that apply primarily to local streets, neighborhood streets. They do not address things like how do you build a major arterial. Portland really believes that standards are not the way to go when you're looking at things like street improvements on major streets, because each one is unique and has different needs and has different functions. So we've designed arterial streets on a case-by-case basis, but we do have to have street standards for the local streets to meet regional and state requirements. We also have project development guidelines that the Office of Transportation uses when it undertakes a transportation project. We've incorporated those into the TSP. It identifies how you take a project from sort of concept all the way through to adoption. and it talks about public involvement as well as doing a policy scan and things like that, as well as creating alternatives and evaluating those alternatives. We also have strategies that the Office of Transportation uses to meet sustainable infrastructure policy requirements. These are strategies that have been created and implemented primarily by our Maintenance Bureau. They've done a lot of things over the last 5 to 10 years to really reduce the impact of transportation improvements on the environment. Titles 16 and 17, I wanted to go in a little bit more detail. There's not a lot of changes that we made to these two titles. We did give the city engineer additional authority. One of the most interesting things is that we now have the authority to require bike parking improvements in the right-of-way as a part of your development. And we also have given the city engineer authority to ask for public streets on large sites that are not going through a land division. The connectivity requirements are only required for large sites that are being developed, for instance, as a subdivision. We also want public streets to be part of larger projects such as shopping centers, potentially, institutional campuses, and things like that. So we have given the city engineer authority to ask for those streets. In Title 33, we did quite a few changes to the zoning code. I'm only going to touch on a few that you might find, I think, most interesting. We have new requirements for large parking lots that have to have something called street-like features. That means that even if we're not asking for a public street grid within a large shopping center or something that has a lot of parking, we are asking for features that create the sort of a lower level set of streets that aren't public but that do have curbs and sidewalks and street trees, so it looks very much like a public street system. And this was a change to the transportation plan, reflects a change to the transportation planning rule and the regional transportation plan that was done in 1999 in the case of the transportation planning rule, and that we needed to incorporate. We also prohibited drive-through facilities. Those are the part of a use that has the drive-through in it. That could be fast food, it could be quick lube, it could be your drive-through mocha place. So we've prohibited those drive-through facilities in our highest density zones. So the areas where we want a lot of development and a lot of mix of uses, we felt that those drive-throughs were incompatible with the kind of environment we were trying to create, so we actually prohibit those. We also strengthened the connectivity requirements in Title 33 to be consistent with what we put into Title 17. As I mentioned, we have very strict parking regulations in the City of Portland. One of the things that we did to discourage large expanses of parking lots or encourage the right kind of development that we wanted along our major transit corridors was to eliminate all minimum parking requirements for any kind of development within 500 feet of high-quality transit service. And we defined high-quality transit service to be 20-minute or better peak service in the 20-minute or better service in the peak hour. So if you have good transit service, what we're saying to developers is you don't need to put parking in, or if you do put parking in, we're not requiring that parking. And so we're hoping that that will reduce the amount of parking that is constructed over time and result in a better pedestrian environment, because you aren't going to be walking through next to large expanses of parking lots on our main streets. The other thing I wanted to talk about a little bit is we do regulate park and ride lots that are associated with transit. In the past, we only regulated them on private property. And what we found out with the potential for light rail to be placed in the I-205 corridor, that there was also a potential for park and ride lots to be placed in the public right-of-way in that corridor. And we felt that we really needed to have controls on those park and ride lots, so they are regulated now as conditional uses on public right-of-way as well as on private land. And we really want to make sure we're not overbuilding park and ride lots, or that those are the the quick and easy answer to how to get transit ridership. Park and ride lots should be the last resort, not the first thing you turn to. We've also done a lot of little fixes in Title 33 that I'm not going to go into today. What I will tell you is that if you look at the TSP on the website, what I've just talked about in terms of code amendments, those are not in that document that's on the website. And the reason they're not is that they've already been incorporated into the relevant codes. And what's in the Transportation System Plan is just a summary of the changes that were made, not the actual code language. So if you're curious about the exact code language, give me a call and I'll tell you where to find it in the codes.
Okay, so just a brief sort of ending, sort of administrative stuff of if you want to use the TSP, where do you find it, how do you use it? We've got 4 volumes in the Transportation System Plan, and as you can see, they're stacked up there. They're pretty big. But Volume 1 really kind of incorporates most of the information that people will be needing. It's got the policies, the street classifications, and maps that Jeanne talked about. On the website, everything's divided into the districts. So the project list is, the modal plans, the summary of the code changes that Jeanne just mentioned, as well as a list of refinement plans and studies. Volume 2 has our financial plan, performance measures, and a summary of other recent studies. Volume 3 has the reference list projects that I talked about and the appendices. And then Volume 4 is an inventory of the system that was done in
1996.
So, as we've talked about, it's available on our website, which is up here and in your packet. It's a PDF document. Each chapter is sort of outlined pretty well. We have CDs and hard copies are available for purchase. And you can always contact Jeanne or I if you've got questions both about policy-related stuff or additional trainings or briefings or just sort of questions in general. You can contact either one of us.
And we wanted to open up to questions now because there may be things that you're interested in that we haven't covered because we have done this as sort of a general briefing approach. So we want to make sure that all your questions are answered and things that you are interested in we can talk about. So the questions in the back, and push your button.
There's been a pretty active advertising campaign by the City of Portland to encourage downtown retail shopping. And in the ad, I think they even show a couple in a vehicle going downtown with bumper stickers and shopping downtown. The strict limits on parking has the downtown retail advertising campaign, the downtown retail push been incorporated in any of that? And as far as limiting restrictions on those types of parking?
Well, we really feel like the way we provide parking downtown is through public garages. And we really don't want to encourage individual businesses to build their own parking. So the parking ratios that are established for the downtown are really meant to address a certain amount of employee parking, but we really expect the retail shoppers to be using the public structures or on-street parking. We've structured if you do park in the public structures at all, you'll realize it's structured in a way so it's less expensive for the short shopping trips and more expensive if you're parking all day. And that's how we manage to discourage the employees from driving downtown, but encourage shoppers to come down. And of course we encourage the shoppers to come down not just by car, but by streetcar or public transit as well, or by bike by providing public bicycle parking in those public parking structures. So we're really trying to make sure that people have those choices available to them without overbuilding the parking supply. And I think one of the things that really sets Portland apart, if you look at an aerial of Portland versus other downtown core areas, is other downtown core areas have a significant amount of surface parking. And we just don't have that much in the core area of the downtown here compared to other cities. And really have tried to put policies in place that those surface lots would redevelop over time into a higher intensity use. And as retail shopping demand would increase over time, we would expect to be providing additional public parking structures as the way of providing what we call an adequate but not excessive amount of parking. In the middle?
Here on page 5.
Push your button.
One of your slides here, page 5, under the project list, on the slide at the top, there's a refinement plans and says identified by the community. How is and when is that process started? And then also you mentioned you have your benchmarks and measures, and you have to create a balance in project types.
Right.
So how and when is that the refinement plans and the studies started by some community interest or need?
Well,
how does that reflect with the existing project?
The studies list that we have was actually a collection of studies that had already been identified by the community from neighborhood plans that had already been adopted. And we also had new studies put on that list by the community as we were developing the TSP. The division transportation and land use study that's on that study list actually is in the TSP because a group of community members who were interested in improving Division as a main street came to us and said, we really want to have the right kinds of projects on Division. We're not exactly sure what we need or where we want them to go, but we really think Division needs help to become the kind of main street we want. Because we didn't have specific projects in mind, that's why that became a study. And we're now undertaking that study because at least it looks very positive for us right now that we will be receiving transportation and growth management funding to take on that particular study. As Courtney said, there's no list of priorities among the studies. We expect when we do the first update of the TSP in a few years that the community will again have identified things that they want to have addressed in their community and come to us. If there's specific things that are project level, then they would go on the project list. If they're a more undefined kind of a wish for their neighborhood, that would become a study. So we'll add to those over time, and as we complete them, of course, they'll drop out of the plan. In terms of the performance measures and benchmarks, we try to get the most bang for our buck, I guess is the best way of putting that. We want to make sure we're making progress over time in achieving our goals. We need to select from doing the refinement plans we know we need to do up front. Those are really important to do in the near term. The studies, we're trying to be selective and making sure the ones that go forward are the ones that we think we're going to get the most benefit out of in the near future as opposed to the far future. Division seemed like a really ripe corridor for upgrading, much like other main streets in southeast Portland have. So that seemed timely to push forward with that one, to get funding for that now rather than putting it on kind of the back burner. Other studies on the list don't necessarily have a big impact in terms of meeting those performance measures or benchmarks, and so we would give those a lower priority. We don't have a formal prioritization of the studies at this point. It's more of a what seems timely, what do we think we can get funding for, and which ones have a lot of community support, frankly, because we want to undertake things that the community feels ownership of, and we're not in the business of pushing something down a neighborhood's throat and saying, you're going to be studied now whether you like it or not. That's just not the way we operate.
So it's not a form that a citizen group fills out. It's just they have to show up to community meetings more often than the other groups.
Right, and at our capital improvement program budget hearings and things like that, when we're talking about where we're going to be spending money in the coming years, that's a public process where the community can come in and address the projects that we're considering for construction in the next few years, but also identify new things that's not on our project list, and certainly that's an opportunity to let us know what things we should be studying in the future. A few years ago, the city actually had a formal process that was called Neighborhood Needs Requests, and the community did identify on a sheet of paper, here's what we want to do, and sent that to the city. It then got sorted to all the various bureaus that would deal with those issues, and then the bureaus had to make a formal response back to that community on whether they would or wouldn't undertake that neighborhood need. That process was discontinued probably 4 years ago, maybe more than that, because it was in a way it was setting up unrealistic expectations among the community that we really could undertake all these things when in fact we did not have the funding available to do that. So now at least the Office of Transportation is using the TSP updates as the forum for that sort of formal process of getting more input from the community. Somebody over here?
I don't have a button, so I'll talk loudly. Is there any inclusion in the TSP for plans to transfer ownership of some state highways such as Sandy or Powell Boulevard from ODOT to PDOT? And if so, is there also a plan for integration of these state highways back into the communities?
Let me
repeat
repeat the question in case that didn't get picked up on the microphone. The question was, is there anything in the TSP that addresses transferring ownership of the state highways into the city's transportation system? And then essentially what do we do with them once we have them? Is that okay? We do identify that as an issue in the transportation system plan. We have been working with ODOT in the last few years to do just that. We do identify it in the TSP. It's a very complicated issue because of the cost of maintenance. And the agreement that we have with ODOT right now is the city does the plan for the street. It identifies the improvements. We get funding for the improvements. When the improvements go in, the city then takes over jurisdiction of that state highway. And that's what we're doing with the Hollywood Sandy plan, was just that. The plan identified the improvements we wanted done on Sandy Boulevard. We sought and received funding through the OT process, which I can't remember what OT stands for, but it's state funding. It was a bonding measure that the state undertook a couple of years ago. We are doing additional design and engineering work for those improvements. When the improvements go in, then the state will transfer Sandy over to the city of Portland. But we are looking in the city on a broader basis of how we would do that, like sort of an accelerated way to get those state highways. And we've just started working with the state on what the issues would be, what the policy issues, as well as what the financial obligations would be if the city took over all those state facilities. As you probably know, some of them are not in very good shape, and that's a terrible burden financially to put on the city of Portland when we have very limited transportation dollars to maintain the streets we do have. But what that allows us to do as part of the planning process, particularly for Sandy Boulevard, was to look at improvements to Sandy Boulevard that were not highway improvements. We were really looking at things that would make Sandy operate as a main street, and that included closing some of the odd-angled streets that create really difficult pedestrian crossings, doing curb extensions, doing additional pedestrian crossings on the street. And the state had to agree to that, to those improvements, before they would, allocate money to us to do those improvements. So we had to work very closely with the state. What we hope over time is that these we call them orphan highways. What we're hoping over time is that we get additional funding, probably from the federal government. Congressman Blumenauer is looking very closely at that issue. He's very supportive of getting federal funding to do that at an accelerated rate so that we can take over those highways and design and operate them in a way that's more consistent with a city street rather than a highway. Okay. Right here.
Talk a lot about minimizing parking, especially near transit corridors, in the hopes that people will change their behavior. And that is a nice vision, but I wonder if you have any empirical evidence that's based on it. Because I've studied TODs in Portland, transit-oriented developments, a fair amount. And every time I go out and observe one of these projects that was deliberately underbuilt for parking, all I observe is that the parking problem is externalized to surrounding neighborhoods, and you've created a conflict because people, in fact, don't change their behavior, at least not in a significant way. So I was just curious, what do you actually know about parking and high-density developments in transit corridors?
A couple of things. I don't think we have empirical evidence, and I think there's a couple of different scenarios that we're expecting to happen as people build less parking. There are the very large developments which are going to always put in parking. I mean, a large grocery store is, I would, at least not my lifetime, is not going to go in without any parking at all. But what we have found is that smaller developments that have relatively low parking requirements in terms of it might be 10 or 15 spaces, what we're finding is that the community is actually coming to us and saying and asking us to put these regulations in place to eliminate the parking because they're not getting the kind of development that they want in the neighborhood that they want to walk to. So the city did not propose eliminating parking on its own. It really worked with the community to do that, and we weren't as radical as we might have been. We talked about in developing these regulations that we might, just eliminate all minimum parking requirements citywide for all uses. And we really checked in with our Citizen Advisory Committee, we checked in with the community, we checked in with the Planning Commission and said, here's the range we can do. You can do no changes to eliminating it all. And we really felt like we're starting to take relatively small steps. We will evaluate that and see how it works. Are we indeed getting complaints from the neighborhoods that the parking is happening on their neighborhood streets? And we won't go forward if it's a problem. But we really feel that this is a rather modest way to start saying, sending a message to the development community. We don't have an expectation that you're going to build parking for every single employee and every single shopper that comes to your business. We have an expectation that people will be taking the streetcar and transit, at least in part, or walking if you're providing neighborhood services. Anecdotally, I live in Northwest Portland. It's extremely dense. There's very little parking. We have the highest mode splits for alternatives to the auto of any part of the state. I think it is about, let's see if I say this right, 30% of the trips in Northwest Portland are walking trips, which is an incredibly high split. If you look at places like downtown where we don't allow a lot of parking to be built for individual businesses, the mode split is around 50% transit trips for employees. So we feel it's working, and that's what, but we do want to be fairly cautious in our approach so that we're not getting ahead of where the market is and ahead of where the community is in terms of looking at this balance between parking and encouraging alternative modes.
How much in the project list, I mean, I heard you saying things about how much community support a project or a study gets, and that's so important. Like, there's other really important criteria. How much does like the geographic distribution of projects get considered, like the kind of an even or equitable distribution of projects? And are there ever community groups other than like neighborhood associations or neighborhood plans that suggest to you things that they would like to see done?
Geographic distribution is important. It's not a specific criteria in the project selection criteria, but we do try to make sure that we're addressing issues in all parts of the community. Even though we spend a very high proportion of transportation dollars in the central city and in developing areas like River District, North Macadam will be another area that gets a lot of transportation dollars because not only does it need a lot, but it's an area where we have an expectation that we'll get a lot of growth. We also want to make sure we're addressing issues in neighborhoods across the city. Obviously, some neighborhoods have more transportation needs than others, particularly Southwest, where we have a very incomplete system of sidewalks. That's an area where there's a lot of pedestrian projects identified. Other parts of the city that are fairly well built out and have a complete grid of streets and sidewalks are all there. They're probably not going to get as many transportation dollars spent on them. The reference list really allows us to be pretty selective in making sure that whatever the community has identified as important, those things get funded as well. And as Courtney said, we're looking at new funding mechanisms to make sure that we can do the kinds of projects the neighborhood wants and have dedicated funding for those sort of smaller scale things that are under the radar of the big streetcar projects and things like that. I think we could do a better job than we're doing right now. I think it is important that we get additional funding so we can do a better job. But definitely that's why when we have our capital improvement program hearings with the public, that's why we ask them to come in and tell us what's important to them. Some neighborhoods feel okay about the way things are operating in their neighborhood and don't come forward. Some parts of the community are very vocal and can round up 90 to 100 people to come to the hearings and say, we want whatever it is. The hot topic right now is safe routes to schools. Commissioner Blumenauer is also interested in that and securing federal funding to do those kind of projects as well. So we're hopeful that we'll get more flexible funding to put towards those smaller community projects that don't get the big state tax dollars or the redeveloping areas, which obviously get a lot of funding right now. Did I answer your whole question? Okay, great.
One of the most controversial or debated parts of the TPR is the VMT reduction. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the city of Portland addressed that, because I believe you're one of the only, if not the only, TSP around that actually makes a solid attempt at
That's really willing to talk about the problem. What we did in developing the TSP is to look at what the VMT was today in Portland. We used a slightly different methodology than the region did. And what we found was by, if we did nothing more than what we're doing today and the projects from the Regional Transportation Plan were implemented, we would come very close to meeting our reduction in VMT goals over the next 20 years. Obviously, we want to do more. That's why we added projects to the TSP that addressed those kinds of issues, as well as continuing funding for things like education, which we think is an important tool. Our Transportation Options Group has several projects underway to encourage people to look at alternatives to the automobile when making trips. They're doing a pilot study in Multnomah, the Multnomah neighborhood right now, that's, although pretty small in scale, is looking at ways to sort of empower people to make choices other than the automobile for all trips. We do things like transportation fairs, other kinds of outreach that, in addition to transportation improvements, the sort of capital things that we think will actually help encourage people to make wise choices and reduce our VMT over time. That's why a lot of our projects are actually pedestrian and bicycle projects in the TSP, a fairly large proportion of them. We want to make sure the facilities are there so that when people want to take an alternative to the automobile, they can do that safely. We have also, obviously, some street improvement projects. Some of those are geared to supporting transit service and having better transit service over time, our transit priority projects and things like that. So I think we've got a good balance of projects that address alternative modes as well as the automobile and freight needs. And then programmatically, we're doing a lot in the Office of Transportation that we think will improve our chances of meeting the VMT targets over time. But you're right, most jurisdictions, I mean, when the region looked at the region as a whole in terms of VMT reduction, it was not a very positive picture. And a lot of that is because of I don't want to sound like only Portland is doing good things, because that's not true. But the nature of travel in the suburbs really reduces our ability to meet the VMT goals compared to what Portland can do in a very much more dense and urban environment with a mix of uses, a good grid of streets, good transit service, parking restrictions. We think the parking restrictions are a big part of that by having maximum parking ratios as well. But those all fit together as a package that will allow us to actually meet the 10% reduction in VMT over the next 20 years that the Transportation Planning Rule calls for. Other questions? In the back?
Do you utilize any of Metro's publications like the Livable Streets, Skylines, or Green Streets?
I'm going to do that.
Use your own stuff?
Yeah, I'll let Courtney take that
A little
one.
bit of both. In the implementation area that Jeanne talked about, where we have the right-of-way standards, we actually had to refer to the Creating Livable Streets and the Green Streets handbook. Again, they are handbooks and guidelines; they're not standards. So that sort of forces you to at least think about it when you're going through the policies. In terms of practical implementation, we've started working with our Bureau of Environmental Services, our Water Bureau, and the Office of Transportation, and our Bureau of Maintenance, which is part of transportation, to actually do some of those sort of techniques in there to see if they work. One thing about, and correct me if I'm wrong, but some of the stuff in the Green Streets Handbook, a lot of them really talk about things if you've got a lot of right-of-way. You know, we can make a really great green street if we've got 100 feet and we're starting brand new. And Portland, as we all know, is a pretty built-out city. We're doing a lot of retrofit and a lot of sort of, you know, remodeling sort of our streets. And so we're now experimenting. We have a couple locations. We've got some sort of interdisciplinary project teams to look at things like pervious surfaces, different ways to do stormwater, what things in the streetscape can be changed. The changes in the local improvement district standards reflect a little bit of that too, if you've seen that. Allowing only one sidewalk in certain locations, maybe using a bioswale rather than a full tree well, things like that. So it's definitely referenced, and I'd also say that in the environmental sustainability policies and in a lot of our implementation stuff, it's really reflected that we're trying to make an effort to do something different, and there's policy direction to try something new. Doesn't necessarily mean that we'll have new standards that do that, but there's policy direction that let's try that. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think just one other thing is the Creating Livable Streets handbook, which I participated on the committee that helped develop that. Those concepts relate to the street design classification that I talked about. So our street design classifications are reflective of what's in Creating Livable Streets, and how we use the handbook is if we're doing a street on the regional system, we must consider those handbooks, both Creating Livable Streets and the Green Streets handbooks. Those have to be incorporated into our thinking about how we make improvements to the streets, as Courtney said. And they're very much our street designs are very much parallel to what Metro has. So it's a pretty clear, straightforward translation between what they have and what we've done. Paul?
Yes, thanks for a great presentation, Jeanne and Courtney. And either one of you may know the answer to this. I saw recently a published version of the Southwest Trails or Walkway map, and I'm wondering if that got incorporated into the TSP at all.
It's an amendment. It's an amendment, an appendix to the TSP. Some of the trails we looked at that map. Some things were incorporated as a part of off-street paths or city walkway designation changes. It was not a wholesale put the map over the old map and that's the new system. It is referenced and it is an appendix.
Can I just hopefully just click on this? I see a sign on Terwilliger that says Southwest Trails and the number 4.
And
what does that mean?
That's go to the Southwest Trails map and it's trail number 4.
Okay.
And they're trying to. Southwest Trails is a sort of its own sort of an ad hoc committee that helped write that plan with the Office of Transportation. Now they're trying to sign those trails. I think at a certain point they want to have names for them rather than number 4. It'll be the, whoever Memorial Trail. So that's what it refers to. I think it's on our website too, but it's just trying to get people through that trail system, which includes both public right-of-way, private easements, parks, sidewalks, things like that. So it really kind of weaves around. And if people want a copy of that, they can feel free to contact me too.
Other questions? Anything else? Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next week, Terry Sullivan talks about
My eye.
jobs and car ownership.
Jobs and car ownership. Like, you're more willing to own a car if you have a job, or more if you're unemployed, you don't have a car?
Yeah.
Do I dare take this thing off myself, or will I wreck it?
I don't know, and I don't know how to get the CD back either. Oh, you did good.